Welcome back to the Practical Spirituality Podcast. We are so excited to have you on this journey with us, where we explore all elements of mind, body, emotions, and soul through the lens of everyday life. We love recording this show and are very appreciative of all the positive feedback we've been getting and the thousands of listeners who are tuning in every week. The show does take a lot of time and effort and investment from us. We would love to keep this going, and we need your help to do it. Please support the show by joining our community at Patreon. Our Patreon community get ongoing access to new and exclusive episodes, even after the completion of this initial season. You can find the link in our podcast bio in the description of each episode, or you can go to www.patreon.com/Practical Spirituality Podcast. On this week's episode, we will explore why it is so hard for us to love and accept ourselves. You know, the other morning, I was sitting in silence and I was thinking about self-love and self-care. And I was thinking about all the different variations of self-love and self-care that's out there. And for me, one of the ones that I don't think anybody pays any attention to is being able to sit with your emotions and sit with the messiness of your emotions without distracting, running away, trying to get away from them. To me, that's a form of self-love. And so I thought today, why don't we talk about that? How do you feel about that?
I think it's true. Like when it comes to self-love and self-care, it's such an evolution for most people of what that actually looks like over a period of time. And especially when it comes to our thoughts or our emotions, that's what we've been taught to keep the most distant. So therefore, when people are presented with the idea of sitting with their emotions or thoughts as a form of self-love and self-care, it's a very alien concept because people really don't like the idea of that. So how is that self-love and self-care? So there's that automatically that disconnect.
Right. And a lot of people would even say to me that it's like selfish and, you know, indulgent, and what good is it going to do, basically, if you sit in your emotions? You know, I see it as a form of acceptance and being able to accept all of me instead of just going, just give myself a bath, you know, which I do. It's my favorite form of self-care. But I also think that it's equally as important to be able to sit with those different things that are happening for me. For me, this is one of the most important parts about self-love and self-care. And I just thought maybe you could expand on why it's so important.
Well, like most things, I think we go through it as it's a journey. And I think even if we look at our own lives, how self-love and self-care has evolved even for us over so many years, over the decades, depending on where we were at and what our understanding of what that was and what our needs were. Because say for self-love and self-care for what it is for you and I now, that is not what it is for other people by any means. But I think it's really important to understand the journey of what it has taken to get to this stage of it, because we definitely didn't get there on our own. It took a lot of support, a lot of help to understand and the evolution of it. No matter what you describe or what is your currently self-care, self-love routine, if we want to put it that way, it always requires making the time for yourself, which I think is actually where is the base of it. And that's where people honestly need to start. So even if it is something as simple as going for a walk, having a bath, whatever it might be, it is just getting a separation from when we're often in autopilot and to begin to actually take a step back from our day-to-day lives.
And I guess the reason I wanted to bring up this type of particular self-love and self-care is because for years, when my kids were growing up, my number one way of self-care was going for a walk or taking a bath. But what I hated about it is I'd go in and I'd set up the candles and I'd have beautiful music and I'd spend an hour in there and I'd get out of the bathtub and the kids would do one thing and I'd be screaming at them. Well, maybe not screaming, but, you know, the peace and tranquility and the calm right back out the window. And so, of course, I felt like I failed.
Yep.
Because I didn't understand how could I go from peaceful to upset in 0 to nothing. So for me, I think it's just after a while, I felt like I still take baths. It's still a form of self-care that I like. But I guess, as you said, where we're at and the more that we grow, we have a bigger awareness of it.
Because I do think it is coming back to getting into the habit of creating time for ourselves is step one. Often, many of us live very busy lives. Maybe a lot of us have kids, or maybe jobs that take a lot out of us, or both, including relationships. When you are able to create that time for yourself, you don't know what time of day or night you're actually going to get that time. Even if we're talking about self-love and self-care, working on your mind or your emotions, or even going to therapy, it doesn't always mean that the time we have available will fit with the time to go to a session or to do those things. So therefore, we need to work with what we have. But I think it's making that work for us, which is even something that many of us still haven't been taught to do or know how to do. So there's no doubt that even taking a bath, relaxing, calming ourselves. But then there's also a reality of there's still kids in the house, there's still a full-time job, there's still stuff going on. And I think it's that getting time to yourself and relaxing is better than not having it at all. And that is, of course, step number one of actually being able to show yourself that. But it's like, how can I make this a part of my routine on an ongoing basis as possible, with the awareness or understanding that it's going to be buildable over many days, weeks, months, years, and it will evolve into other ways in which we're talking about what self-love and self-care is as we continue to develop and explore.
Right. And so I think I would say that learning how to be with all of ourselves is a very important form of that self-love. And so, if we're talking about setting aside that time, then how do we actually, if we have no idea, how do we actually start to build a healthy relationship with ourselves? And what does that look like? I mean, how do we do that?
I think especially with whatever that time is set aside, it'll be 30 minutes, 15 minutes, an hour, whatever it might be. It's about using that time to actually to explore ourselves with the energy that we have to do it. So if it's in the bath, we could be reading a certain book that would help us actually have realizations, or actually to educate ourselves on ourselves. That is a form of self-love and self-care, versus, shall we say, putting on a TV show or a movie or something that we're clearly doing in order to distract ourselves. Now, I know sometimes we don't have the mental capacity at times to continue to do that because of the day that's in it. But the point is, it's about trying to work towards understanding that time that we're freeing up for ourselves. And this new way of self-love and self-care is about educating ourselves, on exploring ourselves in whatever way we can with the time that we're given, and with maybe the budget at times, even with what we're given, because that changes and varies for each person. There's a lot of different factors involved. But what we can't be doing in theory is using the time that we do have free to distract ourselves away from ourselves, because that doesn't change anything.
No, and I know for a long time that I used to love reading a book, and I would call that self-care, because it took me out of my life, and it seemed like relaxation. But in the terms that and we're not saying it's not a form of self-love, but then at some point we want to move forward from that and go, okay, I'm using the book to distract. Why do I need to distract? Correct?
I agree. But I do think it does naturally take time for our minds to understand that actually investing in ourselves in this way doesn't have to be exhausting, considering it is the answer long term of what we're actually looking for. But it's the resistance of actually exploring something new, because often we don't like change and we think it's going to take more energy from us, and we're trying to actually recuperate our energy. We're not trying to spend more. So even that in itself is where a lot of us get caught in even using what time we have to invest into ourselves.
Right. And so my experience is, especially once I started learning about my emotions and understanding what was driving that, like the trauma from the past that was driving it. And as I started to explore all that, one of the biggest forms of self-love that I used to do is when, this happened when I was in my relationship, when I would get triggered, I would go, can you just hang on a second? I just need to run to the restroom. And I would go to the to the restroom, and I would sit in there and sit with myself, sit with those emotions till that calmed down enough for me to be more present, to be able to go out and have an adult conversation. Now, when that first got suggested to me, I thought it was a bit insane and not practical, but it became my number one tool for a long time because I was getting triggered, going 0 to nothing and being in reaction mode rather than actually understanding what the trigger was, why I was triggered, and how can I calm myself. So to me, it's an extremely important part of the equation because I could take baths and go for walks and read books till the cows came home, but I was still getting triggered.
It wasn't changing the reality of the situations that you were part of or in. And we both know that those things often do not change overnight, the positions that we're in. But this is why often we need to create this space to be able to look at it in a different light more often than not. And it takes a lot of different people, books to be able to educate ourselves on it. But this is why something as simple as a 15-minute sitting with ourselves with no distractions, reading a book, listening to a podcast, watching a video, it all contributes to this new evolution of what self-love and self-care actually is instead of distracting ourselves.
Exactly. And so is there a point that when we're doing that, it can become merely another distraction or become selfishness to be doing that, taking care of ourselves?
Because naturally, as we continue to give ourselves more self-love and self-care and spending more time with ourselves, investing in ourselves, that's naturally going to create change, that it be big or small over a period of time. And as we've talked about in previous episodes, a lot of people don't like change, and normally we don't even like change within ourselves, never mind other people witnessing it. So therefore, if there's change occurring that affects ourselves and other people, there's certain key words that people can use to us to trigger us, as we both know, to make us actually take a few steps back. So suddenly, if a part of your weekly routine has been to go for your walk, take your bath, go to the spa, go out with friends and silent walk or whatever it might be, and say if that's actually doing its job and working, and the changes are occurring, wouldn't take much for a person to be, you're being very selfish with your time to try to knock you off that trajectory at times to continue that change, which I know sounds strange, and why would someone do that to us at times? But especially if change within us also brings up the lack of change in other people, which is very triggering for other people, even on a subconscious level, and therefore these sort of comments can come out and end up triggering each other to kind of self-sabotage and to sabotage not only our own self-love and self-care, but also other people's.
I would 100% agree with that because I've had that experience. I think it's interesting that you said, like, one of the things we can do is, sitting quietly in the silence. And I know that that's something, a practice that I do, but I found it very, very difficult in the beginning. So why is it so hard for us to simply sit in the silence with ourselves?
Well, I think even in the practice of actually sitting in the silence is to actually understand that it's not going to be silent for a long time. To actually experience the silence is not to ignore the thoughts, it's actually understand or begin that exploration of the curiosity, which we've talked about before, to why the voices or the thoughts are there to begin with. But we can only actually ever get to know something by spending more time with it. So if we're constantly ignoring these things that are going on within us, or are not making the time even to explore these areas, how can we ever become more educated on ourselves? So behind every thought is an emotion, more often than not, if we actually begin to take the time to actually sit with it. But that's why these thoughts are often emotionally charged, because they're trying to get our attention to actually teach us something about ourselves. But if we're not exploring it, then it's only going to continue to get louder and louder over a period of time to get our attention because we're not listening to it.
So, so I'm going to jump in there and say, I know that for years I was very aware of, as you're calling it thoughts, I would call it my inner critic. And that inner critic that annihilated me. But I was scared to death to tell anybody that there was a voice in my head talking to me. Because when I was growing up, if you said something like that, then you were off to the, the mental health institute, and I was terrified. So it wasn't until much later in life when I was in a self-help group and people were talking about it. And I remember this one guy got up and he started talking about the committee in his head. And I went, "What are you doing? Don't do that. They're going to take you away." But that is the other reason why it's important, isn't it? For us to be able to understand that these thoughts have emotions that are driving a lot of our behavior that we have no clue as to why we have them.
And the thing is about when we have any thoughts, that be positively or negatively, the experience of actually experiencing that thought makes us feel as if we're the only person in the world to ever have that thought.
Exactly.
It is a very isolating thing because, as you said, it's never talked out in our homes, with friends, in school, in education, at work. So therefore, it's understandable to why the voices in our head get so much louder over a period of time, because it's not being expressed.
Mm-hmm. And until we were able to sit, because that's part of the messiness that I was talking about, until we're able to sit with that and lose the fear of it, I think, and then have an understanding of why it's happening, we're just going to continue to distract, to try and run away from it, right?
Exactly, because at the moment, and I know from experience, and even from what you've been saying on this episode, is that self-love and self-care for a lot of us has been a means to actually just to distract ourselves further and relaxing only one part of us, often being the body. But the mind and emotions in so many ways has been continued to be put to the side and ignored. And that's why even often when we go to the spa or go away for a weekend or go away for a holiday, and when we return home, we're actually still very exhausted in a lot of different ways. And we question, often we need a holiday after the holiday.
Very true. Very true. And I think for myself, when I think about it, I knew how to do the physical self-care, but I definitely didn't understand the emotional and the thoughts, and, had a lot of fear around that. So when I was able to sit with all parts of me, things changed radically, not in my exterior world, but more in my interior world. And that, as many people who know me, is what I have wanted for a long time, because I didn't know how to stop. I didn't know how to sit still. I didn't know how to be with me. I thought that was like almost a ridiculous idea, to sit and be with me.
Because again, we've been taught what self-love and self-care is, and it's been conditioned that we only do self-love and self-care that's approved by others, which kind of takes away the point of self-love and self-care, because we're doing it for other people to see.
So true. Yep. That's very true.
So when it comes to self-love and self-care, the definition that you and I are probably evolved into at this point is understanding the self in mind, body, emotions, and soul. And that's the love and attention and care that it actually needs. But as we both know, that is different for every single person, because every person is in very different circumstances and requires different levels of understandings, assistance, and help. And that is why often we need to learn to carve out that time to begin to take responsibility for what we can give it over an extended period of time.
That's so true. And taking into account that, if you're a young mother and you've got kids running around screaming, it's not going to be so easy to go and sit very quietly for 30 minutes and be with your emotions and your thoughts.
Exactly. So it's about finding what works for you under your circumstances at the moment, because again, what works for someone else more often than not will not work for you. And that's why often we have to allow even whatever time we can give it to pull away from the noise, just to begin to chip away at working out what does it look like for me and what actually are my needs when it comes to self-love and self-care.
So why do you think it is that we often prioritize pleasing other people over taking care of ourselves?
Because from a very young age, it's that we always, even in the moments that we talk about self, we've always been taught to prioritize other people. If we meet other people's needs, then that creates value. It creates value in the eyes of other people, that we actually add value to their life, which normally gives us self-esteem. It allows us to feel loved. It allows us to. So this is where it's a transaction more often than not, because it's that we come from certain backgrounds where we have to build on an ongoing basis to actually make changes in our lives. A lot of us are in survival modes. We do live in a capitalist world. And we do need to actually more often not climb the ladder to get social approval, to get raises in our jobs. And to do that means to actually please other people, because if we only please ourselves, then we often see that nothing changes externally and we are in a very materialistic world.
I would agree with that. And I would like to say, because if you hadn't said that last bit, my experience is that, when someone has been through a lot of trauma and they don't, especially at a very young age, they don't know how to take care of themselves. The survival technique then is to please others, because if I keep them happy, then I'm going to stay alive. That then becomes very unconscious as we grow up, and we just continue the behavior because we don't understand it and we just keep doing it. And of course, it gets us lots of results. Like you said, we're climbing the social ladder, we're climbing our career ladder, and that does tend to help until you get to that point of exhaustion that you can't do it anymore and you feel like a complete failure.
Or else you have ticked all the boxes and got to the top of the ladder and realized that you still feel the exact same way, or you're actually no more aware for the most part of what's going on in your mind and your emotions. And that's often when people get to their 40s, 50s, 60s and they're saying, I've ticked all the boxes that's been required of me or what I've been conditioned to do. So what's missing? What's my purpose? And that's where it does become quite interesting, because that is where the evolution of what self-love and self-care does change for a lot of people within that window in life.
Right, it does. I mean, it started to change for me a little bit earlier than that, but it's because I had no choice. And having said that, I still came kicking and screaming about, I still wanted to prioritize others above me. And I can share with you, even just recently it happened, as my son's just had a baby, called me up. I was really sick. He's like, Mom, can you come and help? And it was amazing to me that pull was still there, because it was like, oh, he needs me. I need to drop everything and run. And I'm like, but wait, I can't because I'm sick. Not because I'm sick, but because if I go, I'll make them sick. And I had to really calm myself on that, because my first thought was, wait, but I can't. But it wasn't about me. It was about them. And I think that's an important point, because often we have an awareness and we think, you know what? Okay, I get it now. So I can prioritize me. Yet even still, we have the remnants that keep coming up until we actually can find that real pause button to find it.
Because I know even in our time together, self-love and self-care, part of that journey for you has been that ability to say no to others. But at the same time, it's about actually the ability to free up the time to actually sit with why we might have the inability to say no.
Right.
Which is about understanding the mind and emotions in general, our experiences in our past. And at this stage, for both of us, that is the core definition of self-love and self-care, of looking after, as we talked about, mind, body, emotions, and soul as we go through our day-to-day lives.
And I think it's important to give ourselves the permission to have the meltdown, because even on my journey through that, it wasn't until I was in the absolute meltdown that I could actually explore what you were talking about. Because before that, it was just knee-jerk reaction, just go, please, please, please. So it was in having the meltdown that allowed me to do it differently. And one of the other things that I've always struggled with is, how is it that we're able to utilize that self-love for ourselves when other people aren't being kind to us?
I do think when people are being unkind to us, it's a journey within itself of how that interaction alone does trigger us in mind, body, and emotions in so many ways. And I feel what's actually important is that because we are emotional beings, we're always going to react in a certain way to and in a response. And I feel it's like actually having self-love and self-care after the fact is us not being hard on ourselves in the way in which we responded, and by beating ourselves up, by more changing it in the sense of by actually having curiosity to why we responded in that way with that particular person, and to also begin to question with the person that's involved, is this an ongoing thing in my life where it's actually causing more distress in some ways, or was it just a human moment where they had a stressful day? So it is actually about understanding self-love and self-care as being able to think about it through these different angles to begin to understand in how we respond to it, and is there anything that we can do differently about that from a curious angle in how we express ourselves, and sometimes even create boundaries with the other person at hand by expressing our honesty and our truth to them and how we want to be communicated with.
Right. And I would agree with that. And the mention of boundaries brings me to that. One of my favorite topics is, how do we actually learn to say no to others? Some people would say to protect ourselves, but to really love ourselves is what I'd rather say. Because learning to say no was definitely a self-love action for myself. So would you expand on how people can start to learn how to do that?
In the journey of actually saying no, because often when we say no, it triggers an emotional reaction into another person because their expectation is that you would often say yes. And I think a part of doing the journey is actually for any person is understanding that another person's emotions and how they're feeling is not your responsibility, regardless of what you say. And that's a huge one because the emotion is very quite clear in front of you and how the person is responding. But what isn't taught enough out there is obviously it's been out there a long time, but it doesn't mean it's global or it's been out mainstream in a lot of ways, is that we cannot create emotion in another person. We can only bring up what they have or haven't dealt with from before.
Exactly. And the reason I asked you that question is if you remember my difficulty in learning to say no, and there were so many thoughts and emotions and events that I hadn't begun to understand why saying no was so difficult to me. And so I think one of those first steps would be, okay, the first thing is to go back to sitting with how uncomfortable that feeling is, the messiness. And for me, it was like the first time I had to start saying no, I felt like I was literally going to die. And so I had to sit with that. And then the terminology I use is self-soothe, but to be with me in that fear that that's it, they're going to reject me. No one's ever going to love me again. Might as well just exit the planet because if I say no, they're all gone. Has never been the case yet, but that in the beginning didn't stop the fear. So for me, that was a huge self-love learning point.
Because it's being able to feel it and sit with it instead of our autopilot being to ignore it and run away.
Exactly.
To be actually able to make that transition that we're talking about, it comes from being able to actually be educated more on the subject at hand. Because I think that's something that you and I, throughout our own individual lives, have always been amazed about how undereducated we have been throughout our entire lives when it comes to mind, body, emotions. And how that has played such a huge part in a lot of the traumas or experiences that even to this day we still don't understand.
Absolutely. And one of the things that has always stuck with me that you said to me was, we are taught how to think, but we're not taught how to deal with our emotions and how thought and emotion work together. And that for me was a huge eye-opening point because it was like, yeah, you're right. All that ever happened to my emotions, they were shamed. So it's very interesting. And so I think it is a journey for everybody, and it just depends where they're at. Do you agree?
Yeah, because it's amazing how incredibly hard we are on ourselves for something we haven't been taught to how to deal with or how to navigate. I think self-love and self-care is actually having the logical understanding of that we've never been educated on how to get through life. We've just been thrown into the lion's den and told to deal with it.
Go for it. Get a degree. Get married. Have a house.
Basically, good luck.
Yeah.
I hope you make it out to the other side.
But in all fairness to our parents, they were never taught either.
Exactly. But this is kind of the point as well, is that this is what we all do have in common. But this is what's really interesting, because the more that you actually look into these different areas, the information does exist and has existed for quite some time. It's just we never had the ability to get access to it maybe at an early enough age when we actually needed it.
Very true. I think that's very true.
But this is why it's that now that we know that information does exist, it's not about saying, well, I should have had that because we can't change the past, in fact, that we didn't. But this is why now, as an adult, we need to actually allow ourselves to mature and grow up in certain ways, because now we do have access to the information and we need to start feeding our subconscious and conscious mind on the reality of life and on the different tools in the toolbox that we actually need in order to understand ourselves and others. And that's a huge part of self-love and self-care.
I would agree with that. And the point that I always stumble on with this is we will prioritize everything else. And I guess it's kind of because we've been taught to prioritize everything else. And when I say that, what I mean is, I really need support in working through this. But you know what? Financially, that's going to cost too much money. So I'm just going to kind of wade through it myself instead of understanding that investment in self goes a long way to helping everyone else and your whole entire situation, that in the long run actually is a very smart investment. Would you agree?
As you and I both know, it's amazing looking back at our own individual lives, the excuses we made for ourselves not to invest in ourselves, because we were so scared of change and the unknown that came along with actually beginning to understand ourselves, even when we knew that was the answer that we were looking for.
That's true. That's very true.
And of course, the number one go-to for all of us has been to make the finances a problem of why we can't invest in ourselves. And sometimes that is a reality, of course. But at the same time, it's that for people who I've talked to in the past and they maybe haven't been able to afford sessions or couldn't afford a course or to go educate themselves in that way, I would say, well, can you get access to a library card?
Right.
Can you go to the local library and start reading? Literally name them certain books to begin the journey in some ways, because that is where any of us need to start, regardless of what's in your bank account.
I would agree with that. So then let's talk about, is it even possible to practice self-love when we're being attacked externally? And if it is, how do we do that?
The advancement of self-love is understanding that there's always going to be external attacks, whether we like it or not. And self-love is actually being able to educate ourselves and how we deal with it moving forward.
And I guess I would say to that, as we start learning that, and like you just said prior, the more that we can understand that we can't make anyone feel anything, no one can make us feel anything, and we take responsibility for ourselves. If we're under attack externally, I think it's very possible to self-love, because it's understanding that, okay, so what's it bringing up in me and what can I do about what it's bringing up in me?
It's about understanding, as you said, it's about how we respond. Sometimes it's about how we don't respond, depending on the circumstance also. And it is about seeing the evolution in our behavior, which is actually a huge part of being able to see that growth within us. And there's no better feeling than actually seeing that changes and how it occurs over a period of time, because then we do feel that love, that investment is actually paying off within ourselves, especially in the time at the start when we didn't think it would, or we didn't know where it was actually taking us.
So let's change tack just a little bit. I'm just curious why you think it's so hard for us to really accept genuine love from others.
I think for so long we are confused to what love is at times, because often throughout our lives we've only really ever known love to be quite conditioned when it comes from others. It's very difficult to actually be able to accept or absorb love from others, especially when we've went through life when we've had many experiences where other people's love has been conditioned, and normally would have to act or behave in a certain way in order to receive it. But then even if we go a little step beyond that, is that if we're actually conditioning any of our emotions, that it be negatively or positively, or not expressing it, we're actually limiting our ability to absorb any of our emotions at times if we're even conditioning one, because if you condition one, you condition them all. So to actually be able to experience love to its full extent, shall we say, with it from the self-love perspective, or even from another, we need to understand the self through mind, body, emotions, and soul, and to be able to express all of our thoughts, all of our emotions, and then we begin to actually to be able to absorb and understand love is without it being completely conditioned by ourselves or by others.
I would agree with that. And, I think I would say, quite often our love has been conditioned most of our life. Then us not even having a clue how to love ourselves, much less understand ourselves, then that fear automatically comes up. The wall comes up because the projection is, I'm already hurting me. I'm sure you're going to hurt me. So therefore, nope, not going to let it in. And what you're saying is, until we can really sit with all that messiness and understand it, process it, and start to really accept who we are and love who we are, then we can be more open to receiving it from someone else and even recognizing it. So talking about that, let's talk about the fact that we have this internalized beating ourselves up on a regular basis. Why is it we do that?
I think for a lot of us, if we had a certain plan logically of what we thought life was going to be or what it should be, and it's not meeting that plan, we can become quite hard on ourselves that we've done something wrong, or we've let ourselves down, we've let other people down. Life shouldn't be this hard, it shouldn't be this way. Because we've been taught or conditioned to what life should be versus the reality of what it is.
I also think, though, that we can be conditioned to beat ourselves up through people who constantly negatively referred to us and what our behavior was or how we responded to them from early ages. And so it becomes habitual. So habitual that a lot of people are unaware of just how much they're beating themselves up on a regular basis. Would you agree with that?
I would, because again, if they don't know any different, then that is their reality.
That is the reality. So how do we soothe that behavior? And even before soothing it, how do we recognize it? How do we begin to stop it? So for me, one of the things that I think about when we have this internal beating ourselves up all the time, my journey has been about first recognizing that that's what I'm doing, starting to hear the language I'm using when I'm talking to myself. And then once I can start stopping that language that is not productive or helpful to me, then it's about stopping and going, what part of me feels like I have to beat myself up, and just being present with that part of myself. That's how I would start to soothe that behavior, because so many people don't even realize they're doing it at first. And so once you do, you kind of need those steps, don't you think?
It's so automated that we need those different steps at times really laid out for us to begin to actually put us back into manual, to actually begin to look at it from a completely different angle and to begin to understand or break down the noise, let it be, even if it is the negativity that comes along with it, until something points it out. And even when someone points it out, it seems obvious. But when it's all we've done every single day for a long period of our lives, we don't know any different.
I used to call it the tapes that play in my head because they were just nonstop constantly.
Because we didn't know it could be any other way. So if we think that's just our reality, then therefore there's not really a problem, even if we don't like it, because again, it's all we know.
Exactly. One of the things I often wondered about, Gareth, when I first started this journey was, how in the world was I ever going to be able to learn how to love myself when my perception had been I never really experienced the type of love that I thought I was supposed to have received. And what I have found on the journey of sitting in the messiness, taking that time out to explore, get curious, to start to understand my thoughts and my emotions, and even how I was conditioning myself. Sure, I was taught how to do that, but I was taught from people who didn't know any better. But once I started to really sit with me and understand it, I think the very act of getting curious or wanting to make changes in your life is a form of loving yourself. We just don't identify with that. Would you agree with that?
No, I would, because it's different to your kryptonite. I think self-love is actually being able to accept the reality when we haven't been taught how to accept it by others.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Being able to get to that place of being able to accept the lack of love in our lives at times, or the love that we've been taught by the world that should be in our life, but it hasn't been, and therefore we question then what did I do wrong? What did we do wrong? Why didn't I have that? Whatever it might be. So we've been actually conditioned to experience a love that actually a lot of people don't end up experiencing, and then they are led to believe that they're the problem when it's really not a part of the experience for most people. So I think self-love and self-care is actually being able to accept the reality of what we have been through, and being able to accept that it often wasn't a choice for ourselves or even for the other people that were involved, because they didn't know how to either, as we discussed earlier.
And I think for me, when it came to that, it was incremental steps that I had to take. Like at first, of course, I wanted to blame. Of course, I was angry because I didn't understand it. And then as I started to grow and learn more about myself, more about my emotions, more about my thoughts, more about my own journey, I started to see that one of my favorite sayings, if it's going to be, it's up to me. And that got me through a lot in my life. I never thought for a long time to use that towards myself. So it wasn't until I started to actually go, oh, hang on, wait a second. I'm no longer a little child. I am an adult. And it's time for me to take that task on and start to spend that time with me and start to be kinder to me, because I was as mean to me as anybody else ever was. If not meaner, probably, with the expectations and the criticisms and the judgments that I carried of myself. I couldn't let go of those till I sat in the messiness of it all. And that's why I wanted to bring this topic up, because one of the things someone asked me is, well, how do we be kinder to ourselves in this process? And I think it is taking that time out just to sit, experience it, see that it isn't going to kill us, being able to take that responsibility for our own feelings and emotions and thoughts, and letting go of how we thought it should have been or how we think it should be now, but just accepting how it is in this moment. What do you think about that? Even in the busiest part of life, when we're busy, it's about being able to still be here and pay attention to what's happening for ourselves.
Self-love and self-care as an adult is having the willingness and the curiosity to allow yourself to have access to the information that we didn't have when we were children. And as we talked about before, a lot of us grow older, we don't grow up.
Very true.
And I think self-love and self-care as an adult is allowing ourselves to grow up when our parents or our carers didn't know how to allow us to.
And you will often hear me say to many people, as much as it's not always liked, I had to learn how to parent myself. So I had to learn how to parent myself through all the experiences that I didn't understand, and express love to the parts of me that I was angry at, that I was frustrated with, that I had judged, and just gone, okay, we were doing the best we could at that point in our life. And we're doing it differently now. Or even if we're not doing it differently, I'm in the process of understanding more about it. Would you agree?
That's where I do look forward to us even exploring the topic of love, both internally, externally, moving forward. Because I feel a part of the journey is understanding that when it comes to external, that people will always come and go. And that's why it's so important to be able to find self-love and the love from within. And we realize when we have that, we tend to experience what's internal and having to share it with others, but we're not reliant on an external source to have it.
I couldn't agree more. Thanks so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you would like to explore these topics more with us, please go to www.patreon.com/Practical Spirituality Podcast. Not only will that help us keep producing these shows, but you'll also get advance access to each new episode, the opportunity to ask questions directly of Gareth and I, input into what topics we will cover on the show, access to exclusive content not available anywhere else. See you over on Patreon.